It just happened. The US just bought Bitcoin, but not in the way you might think. How many times have we talked about the US strategic Bitcoin reserve? Now, it actually happened, and no, it wasn't confiscations, it was actual purchases. And Bitcoin price isn't reacting at all. It doesn't care. At the same time, Donald Trump is now announcing his hottest pick for who will become the new Fed president. And it's a Bitcoiner, a well-known Bitcoiner. And the Bitcoin price still doesn't care. How bullish do the news have to get for the Bitcoin price to finally go wild? You can see there's still uncertainty in the market. Let's dive into the whole thing. Federal Reserve run by a Bitcoiner and the US Strategic Bitcoin Reserve activated. If someone had said that a few years ago, people would have thought you were completely nuts. But that's exactly what just happened. Before we get started here, guys, take a second and smash the like button below for higher Bitcoin prices for new all-time highs. And if I show you the sunset, the sunny warmth is already gone, but we can still see this epic aura. How awesome is that? And again, not a single cloud, just the moon up there. And that's where we're headed soon, to the moon with the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. Let's see what happens. And how many times have we heard the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is coming? And then they set up a working group and so on. And you can scroll back about a year or so. Back then, I already said, or maybe it was half a year ago or 3, I have no idea how long. Anyway, I already said that the most likely scenario is not that we'll see Bitcoin purchases directly from the US, but rather from the individual states. And that's exactly what has happened now. The states, after all, are just as much a part of the US. But of course, they have a lot more. Individual freedom. It's not like in Germany. In the US, things are structured a bit more decentralized. And now we have the news that Texas has become the first US state to buy Bitcoin. The Lone Star State invested $5 million in IBIT, BlackRock's Bitcoin spot ETF. He's tied. Lee Bradshaw, president of the Texas Blockchain Council, are also on the platform today. At first, it was reported that it was 10 million in Bitcoin, but it's actually only 5 million. Of course, that's not a huge amount, so it didn't affect the price. You might have thought, okay, if the US is buying Bitcoin now, then we're talking millions. I'm not actually sure yet whether you can say the US is buying or Texas is buying, but Texas is part of the US, so you can probably say the US is buying. Senator Cynthia Lummis has always said that the strategic Bitcoin reserves of individual states will probably come before the general US strategic Bitcoin reserve, like the general strategic Bitcoin reserve in the US. These are two different types of strategic Bitcoin reserves. Very, very interesting as well. There was an official statement from Texas about this. Of course, we'll take a look at that here as well. Let's take a look and fight. By the way, this is an article from Blocktainer here. Texas bought the dip. Texas is the first state that on the 20th November, Bitcoin, with an investment of 10 million US dollars at a price of about $87,000, it was definitely a good entry point. As I said, the thing about the 10 million isn't true. It's only 5 million. Congratulations to financial manager Kelly Hancock and the dedicated investment team at the Texas Treasury who have been closely monitoring this market. Texas may eventually hold the Bitcoin itself, but while the bidding process is ongoing, the first allocation would be made with BlackRock IBIT ETFs. Lee Bradshaw from the Blockchain Council says this here, and that's interesting. That means they're even considering self-custody here. That's also what I always tell you, the safest thing you can do. Keep your Bitcoin on your own hardware wallet. I'll also put a code for 21 Bitcoin down below for you now, or a link. These are still the current Black Friday deals. If you've always wanted to buy a hardware wallet, now's definitely the time to do it. There are discounts of up to 40% in some cases. And then you can even set up self-custody here before Texas does it. And the thing is, there have always been these things like, okay, when is the nation-state FOMO going to start? When are nations going to start buying Bitcoin from each other? We might actually see something like a state-level FOMO before we see nation-state FOMO. So individual states might start competing to secure Bitcoin. We already have several states that, more or less, could potentially set up a strategic Bitcoin reserve. There have been various legislative proposals about this. In some states, they rejected it. I think it was 3 states or so. Honestly, I can't even remember exactly which ones. That said, okay, you can potentially buy Bitcoin here now. I just checked again. New Hampshire and Arizona, those were the 2 states that can potentially buy Bitcoin that passed a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill, but haven't actually bought any yet. Michigan and Wisconsin are 2 states where pension funds already hold Bitcoin. And the thing is, we've seen something similar in the Czech Republic with the central bank, where they also started by investing a small amount, about $1 million. Here in Texas, they're investing $5 million now, and you just take a look at what the feedback is like, how the mechanism works. Then you set up your self-custody or your custody solutions. And then in the next step, you can also make larger purchases. It's also interesting that significant parts of the Bitcoin hash rate are now in Texas. So it makes sense that Texas is so focused on Bitcoin. Now we just have to wait and see if this triggers a kind of chain reaction where even more states pass these pro-Bitcoin laws, meaning they push them through, approve them with the strategic Bitcoin reserve, and then actually go ahead and buy Bitcoin. But you also have to say, it's not exactly the ultra news like some people might have imagined. Donald Trump is now buying 600,000, he's buying 600,000 Bitcoin or something like that. So of course, it wasn't that kind of news. In fact, the market didn't really see it as significant at all. There weren't any big jumps or anything like that in the price. But what's almost even crazier here is this story that's going on at the Federal Reserve. Their former Coinbase advisor, Kevin Hassett, is presenting himself as a candidate for the next chair of the Fed? Hassett is known for his positive attitude toward cryptocurrencies. And now this Hassett would basically be picked by Donald Trump as the hottest candidate for the new Fed chair. And that's really, really significant because he's very, very crypto and Bitcoin friendly. He is also known for his familiarity with cryptocurrency and would be an asset to the crypto industry, as they say here. He is known for his positive attitude. He was a member of Coinbase's Academic and Regulatory Advisory Board. With his appointment, Trump would have a close ally at the head of the central bank, someone he knows well and trusts. And once again, a Bitcoiner has basically slipped into a role that Donald Trump now gets to fill. At this point, there are hardly any positions left in the US government that aren't filled by Bitcoiners, whether it's the Secretary of Health, sometimes the Secretary of Commerce, now the Fed chair, the Treasury Secretary is also pro-Bitcoin, we've got Crypto Caesar. There are just so many people in the Trump administration who are now pro-Bitcoin. There are hardly any left. Name a few relevant positions in the US government that actually aren't held by Bitcoiners anymore. So I don't think there are many left here. We also have a special effect with this asset. And the assessment, if you were to just characterize it, is that it gives us lower interest rates and weaker independence of the Fed. That means a rising Bitcoin price because we have more money, higher deficits, so more money in circulation, rising Bitcoin prices, correspondingly higher deficits, political monetization, and a structurally weaker dollar policy. Every single one of these variables drives capital toward Bitcoin. They want to bury the signal in the noise. Here is the signal. Bitcoin is winning the culture war, the technology war, and the battle for monetary succession, and Hassett's nomination is accelerating this process. So it was mentioned in the speech whether maybe Chris Waller or Stephen Mirren would become the successor here. But now it looks like it will be Hassett. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Treasury Secretary can appoint the Fed president. That means Donald Trump can of course make suggestions here, but ultimately I think the decision lies with Scott Bessent. But Scott Bessent and Donald Trump are so closely connected that, of course, Scott Bessent's probably just Donald Trump's henchman here. At least that's what I assume. But we have further developments here. Now, on CNBC, they're talking about how the U.S. might soon abolish its taxes. Abolishing capital gains tax on Bitcoin. So getting rid of capital gains tax on Bitcoin, scrapping Bitcoin taxes, and even being able to pay your taxes with Bitcoin.
America Act, which would allow Americans to pay their federal taxes in Bitcoin. Tell us about this.
Well, look, we're talking about affordability. That's just your dollar's been getting crushed. You know, the house that you live in didn't inherently get more valuable. The money that you measure it in got worth less. And gold is another indicator, one of the best performers in the past.
First, about Bitcoin. And second, that the denominator here is collapsing. The US dollar keeps losing value. It's not that houses keep getting more valuable. It's that the US dollar keeps depreciating. And Bitcoin and gold make this visible. This is a massive scam, basically a fraud against the public.
Last year, 2 years has been gold. And that's just one of the worst performers has been the dollar. So a lot of people hold other assets. Bitcoin's been one of the big rises over the last 10 years for sure. And you could pay your taxes in Bitcoin and avoid capital gains on that. But the president created a strategic Bitcoin reserve. How do you fund it? Well, having one control point, the treasurer, Secretary of Treasury, control it makes sense. but you can fund it with no government spending just by collecting Bitcoin as payments for taxes. So that's what the Bitcoin for America Act does.
The only ways to provide funding for this initiative are either by collecting voluntary donations from individuals or organizations who wish to contribute, or by permitting the government to accept Bitcoin as a method of payment when people pay their taxes. This approach is established by the legislation known as the Bitcoin for America Act, which specifically designates these two options as the official means of funding the program. Instead, they are immediately withheld in Bitcoin and transferred to the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. So in this way, it's basically tax neutral. You have, just like Bo Hines always said, Bitcoin income. And then you could just hold on to them and gradually build up your Bitcoin reserves. I don't really think they're going to end up with a huge amount of Bitcoin. I mean, how many Bitcoin are we talking about? Maybe it's a few thousand per year, but it's not like we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin that you might expect from such a big nation. I always say this too. If the US wants to become the #1 Bitcoin nation, the crypto superpower of the world, like Donald Trump always says, then they really need to start getting serious about accumulating Bitcoin. Basically, they would have to run Saylor's playbook just on a national scale. They'd have to issue Bitcoins, raise capital, use that to buy Bitcoin, and do a lot more. Then, for all I care, they can become the Bitcoin superpower of the world. But if the individual states here actually manage to buy Bitcoin faster than Donald Trump does, then I don't know if that's really promises made, promises kept, as they always say. Probably it's just a few first movers leading the way, buying Bitcoin on a small scale, like Texas is doing now. The risk you always have if you're not quick enough at the beginning is that other nations might secretly accumulate Bitcoin, and then suddenly it turns out, okay, Russia has bought however many thousands of Bitcoin. That's always a bit of the game theory at play, because from a game theoretical perspective, it actually makes the most sense to buy Bitcoin secretly until your pockets are full and then make the announcement. Because we still don't have an audit. Actually, it's still okay. There will be an audit. There will be an audit so that we can even know how many Bitcoins there actually are in the US. Because it's still unclear whether the marshals gambled away Bitcoin or what the exact situation is now. There was never an audit of Fort Knox either. And Jack Mallers also said that this audit might reveal that the US actually has much less Bitcoin than they publicly claim. And accordingly, if they wanted to cover that up a bit, if they had a lot of Bitcoin, they probably would have already announced it. At least that was Jack Mallers' take. I don't know, but in any case, yeah, it's an interesting development. I wouldn't say it's a good development, because if governments start buying Bitcoin, there will be less Bitcoin left for you. It is what it is. And if you want to buy Bitcoin now, here's the Samsung and others who wanted to sell Bitcoin nuts, step on the gas, but don't panic because, and then the song goes, Circle 21 Bitcoin, the Kremlin saved. Let it run for a long time. We can do one-time or even 3 one-time transfers, limit orders, auto transfers. There's so many great features at 21 Bitcoin. They also work together with VR Bank in the middle, really very smart, and Bitcoin that you can do this here in the German Rhine area. Check it out. With good mid-sized files, you can still get up to 20% on the exercise and the use of image plans. See ya, you guys.